The night my phone rang at 11:37 p.m., the world did not end. It tilted. Henry Carter tightened to strangers. Granddad, to me, was gone. Taken by a drunk driver on a black stretch of highway, ink from a dropped pen bled across my wobbly kitchen table while my apartment breathed through thin walls and I felt ordinary life crack open beneath me. I did not know that in a matter of hours I would be named heir to $7 billion, or that the richest thing I would need to protect was not the money, but my dignity. Until that call, my days were measured in metronome clicks and the clean triumph of a perfect arpeggio. I was 26, a piano teacher who coaxed scales from sticky keys every afternoon, then practiced into the evening until a neighbor knocked on the wall in the rhythm of a reprimand. Rent swallowed my paycheck. Groceries took the crumbs. My secondhand car coughed like a smoker on cold mornings. My parents, Richard and Diane Carter, loved the shine on things, and my brother Ethan loved shortcuts. I learned early that I was scenery in their view of themselves. Only Granddad refused the performance. In his mansion, money behaved like good manners, useful quiet never the point. He would sit beside me at the grand piano and tap my sternum with a dry smile. Chloe money buys an instrument. Music comes from here. What he handed me in those hours was not a fortune. It was permission to be exactly who I was. Grief turned the funeral into a bad dream with good catering. Photographers hovered like crows and vanished when tears lost their shine. My mother fussed about floral height. My father clenched his jaw as if calculating the price of sorrow by the pound. Ethan scrolled, sighing at the inconvenience. I stood by the casket and promised the quiet face I would make him proud. The only answer was the tick of a wall clock that suddenly sounded like a countdown. 2 weeks later at 9 a.m., I pushed through a stained glass door into Michael Turner's restored Victorian. Leather and coffee scented the air. Michael, silver-haired, precise, had the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime lowering flames with facts. He had just said, "My grandfather spoke of me often when the door banged wide and the family swept in on a gust of entitlement. My father, adjusting an expensive watch, my mother's heels cracking the hardwood, Ethan wearing sunglasses indoors, like a joke that thought highly of itself." We sat at a long oak table that held the window light like a stage. Michael adjusted his glasses, opened a leather folder, and read. Henry Carter of sound mind left the entirety of his estate investments and holdings valued at approximately $7 billion to his granddaughter, Chloe Carter. The words came like thunder and then kept echoing. My father lunged to his feet chair, skittering. My mother grabbed the table as if the wood could stop the room from spinning. Ethan slapped his palm on the polish and demanded to know his cut, the way a displeased customer insists an order has been misheard. Heat crawled up my neck. When my father accused me of whispering in a confused old man's ear, Michael pressed a button, and Granddad's face filled a screen. Clear-eyed, deliberate, loving, and unsparing. "Greed has blinded you," he said, naming each of them, then naming me different. "Chloe will carry my legacy with dignity." Silence held, then rage returned like a tide. Michael's calm sluiced through it. Documentation assessments, timestamps, signatures. Contesting would be costly and futile. My father did not hear futile, only costly, and turned his fury on me. I said one word that tossed a lit match onto oil: no. By 6 p.m., the house where I had learned to set the table without being asked had been rearranged into a tribunal. My father stood by the fireplace with a tumbler he did not sip. My mother perched on a chaise as if preparing to deliver a sermon. Ethan sprawled with a laptop and impatience. They offered me 10%, a generous allowance for surrendering everything else. 10% of $7 billion thundered in my ears, $700 million a number, so large it slid toward abstraction. But Granddad's arithmetic had always been different. What multiplies you and what divides you. Dignity, you do not sell. When my father demanded loyalty, I chose love for the man who had loved me without a price tag and said no again. He told me I was no longer his daughter. My mother warned I would regret preferring money to family. I told them they had chosen money over family years ago. The door closed behind me with the finality of a gavel. My car's engine stuttered alive. The road to the mansion curled through oaks that whispered in the dark. At 9:42 p.m., iron gates lifted like sentinels, the family crest cold under my fingertips. The windows glowed as if the house were breathing. Lemon polish and cedar greeted me in the foyer. My footsteps sounded too loud for a place that had once felt like a second heartbeat. I almost said, "I'm home," into the echoing air, when a voice emerged from the staircase, shadow low steady, familiar as a hand offered on a steep step. "Miss Chloe." Robert Hayes stepped forward in a neat uniform, silver threaded through his hair, and kindness stitched into his posture. "Your grandfather left instructions. He said if trouble came, I was to protect you. He said you would need sanctuary here." I exhaled a breath I did not know I had been holding and followed him toward the study where a fire already lived, and the leather armchair still held the shape of the man who used to sit there. Somewhere beyond the gates, tires would soon grind over gravel, for a thin slice of night warmth held, and the house waited with me for whatever morning would demand. Morning found me at the landing with my hand on the banister, waiting for proof that the mansion still belonged to me. From the foyer drifted Robert's voice and the low murmur of another. At 8:58 a.m., Michael Turner stood in the doorway, briefcase in hand, his expression equal parts fatigue and relief. He greeted me softly and stepped into the study where Robert had already coaxed a fire to steady life. On the desk lay a thick envelope sealed with red wax that bore my grandfather's initials. My finger trembled as I broke it. Granddad's letter spoke the way he always had, spare in words, rich in meaning. He said he had built this moment carefully, a harbor in advance of the storm he knew was coming. Wealth, he reminded me, was not for display, but for service. Fear had no seat at a table where truth sat first. Those you love by blood, he warned, may soon choose hunger over honor. Keep the gates of dignity closed against them, no matter how they pound. He listed names of people he trusted to stand with me, names that by the end of that morning would walk through the front door. At 9:21 a.m., Dorothy Reynolds arrived with her cardigan buttoned wrong by one hole and eyes already wet. She had been my grandparents' housekeeper since before I learned middle C from treble G. Her hug collapsed the years between scraped knees and sharpened grief. She carried a narrow box tied with a frayed ribbon. Inside were my grandmother's journals, neat handwriting pressed into thin paper. The entries told stories that memory hides, but truth preserves, visits counted not by holidays, but by need refusals to fund recklessness, written beside bowls of soup love standing guard where anger once stood. On one page, my name appeared beside a note about a fever that broke at 2 a.m. Chloe stayed until dawn. It was a ledger of care. A quiet defense written in ink years before this battle began. By 10:06 a.m., Rosa Martinez crossed the threshold laptop bag slung over her shoulder, and calm settled around her like armor. She had run supply chains beside my grandfather for decades and spoken maps and currents instead of money. She turned spreadsheets into people production lines, into paychecks, logistics, into promises kept. Your grandfather measured success, she said, by the steadiness of lives downstream. Her explanation peeled back the mystery of $7 billion and showed me the heartbeat beneath it, a community, not a vault. Half an hour later, George Patel arrived, his briefcase filled with binders whose tabs looked like a parade of caution. Where Rosa translated ideals into people, George translated them into proof. He explained the trust structures and legal firewalls my grandfather had installed, layers of protection that made the estate unassailable to greed. Anyone reaching for this out of selfishness, he said flatly, will come away with nothing but air and a lawsuit. Even Michael looked impressed. For the first time, the enormity of my inheritance felt less like luck and more like design. At 11:12 a.m., Robert returned with a small case the size of a paperback. Inside were labeled drives and a handwritten list from my grandfather. He had quietly upgraded security, installed discreet cameras, and saved footage of anyone who treated the mansion like a vault instead of a home. Robert's mouth thinned when he confessed that after the funeral, my parents and Ethan had wandered through the rooms like crows, pocketing jewelry and rifling drawers. The footage froze my mother's hand, closing over a velvet box. Michael's jaw tightened, but he only said, "Truth in pixels is still truth." Just before lunch at 11:55 a.m., Judge David Harrison stepped through the door, tall, tired, and carrying the gravity that stills noise on contact. He had known my grandfather long before the wealth existed and had agreed to serve as witness in any dispute. Sitting by the fire as if presiding from a bench, he said, "The law can't make people kind, but it can stop cruelty from looting kindness." His words steadied the air. For the first time since the will reading, I felt something close to safety. By early afternoon, the study table was covered with documents, journals, charts, and drives, a landscape of protection built for this very day. We ate sandwiches. Dorothy assembled each bite, tasting like relief and responsibility. Plans were drawn. Michael would handle any legal assault. Rosa would stabilize the company. George would monitor every transaction. Robert would coordinate security. And Judge Harrison would remain until the storm cleared. My part, they said, was to stand still in truth. At 2:37 p.m., I wandered to the music room. The ivory keys waited cold and familiar. I didn't play. I listened to the house, to the metronome of my pulse, to the sense that Granddad's faith in me had weight and direction. When engines crunched over gravel at 3:03 p.m., no one flinched. Robert lifted his chin. Michael closed a folder. Judge Harrison rose. I smoothed my skirt and took my place in the foyer where I had once waited as a child for permission to run. No permission would come today. I didn't need it. The pounding at the door shook the chandelier. My father's voice followed thick with entitlement. I nodded to Robert. The locks turned back with a clean, final click. The door opened and the storm stepped in, wearing my family's faces. They entered as if the air itself belonged to them. My father, first face, flushed eyes bright with fury. My mother, close behind her perfume, slicing through the room like glass. Ethan dragging in last phone in hand, arrogance worn like armor. Their presence turned the air heavy, charged the kind of pressure before thunder breaks. My father's voice cracked through the foyer. "This is still our house. You have no right to bar us from our own home." I steadied my breath. "Granddad left it to me," I said evenly. "Everything legally and morally. You know that." The words felt foreign in my mouth, but solid. My mother gave a sharp laugh. "Don't be ridiculous, Chloe. You can't even manage rent. What makes you think you can run a $7 billion empire?" Behind her, Ethan smirked, tossing his phone from palm to palm. "Just sign it over. Dad will handle things. You'll get your allowance and can go back to your little piano lessons." Before I could answer, Michael Turner rose calm, bending the chaos around him. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, your father, anticipated this moment. His decision was deliberate, recorded, witnessed, and reaffirmed on video. Contesting the will would be futile." My father snatched the folder from Michael's hand, rifling through papers with shaking fingers, scanning signatures as though sheer rage might rearrange them. "Forged," he barked. "No judge will believe this over his own son's word." A slow, steady voice filled the space.